A lot's going on with federal civil service, and a lot may be going on. So we have two speakers here to discuss that. And they are, they are Jonathan Wolfson, Chief Legal Officer and Policy Director at the Cicero Institute, Carthago Delenda Est. And he was also a policy analyst at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. All right, and seated next to him is Craig Lean, partner at KNL Gates in Washington, D.C.
Oh, thank you.
And prior to that, Craig was a director at the office of the OFCCP. All right, and remember, all these bios are in your handbook, in the booklet that you have here. So we don't want to spend any more time on that. Let us begin with this panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to be here with my dear friend, Jonathan Wolfson. We worked together at the Department of Labor for a number of years. He was the head of the policy shop at Labor, and I was the head of OFCCP in the first Trump administration. And both of us have been in the private sector and him in the nonprofit sector for some time now. And it's just a pleasure to be here today to talk about reimagining the civil service. So let's start with a few statistics. There's different measures, but it's about 2.2 million members of the civil service, 2.2 million federal employees. There's about 600,000 postal employees and about 1.3 million military personnel, making the United States the largest employer in the world. Some say India is close, but it looks like it's the United States. So we're talking about the largest employer, and we're talking about that 2.2 to 2.4 million people within the federal civil service. In addition to that, it should be noted that about 4,500 political appointees are in the federal government. So you have about 2.2 million people, and then you have the 4,500 political appointees that come in and out with administrations. A couple other points to make, just going over the history of this a little bit. So, we all learn, you learn this in social studies in grade school about the Gilded Age and about President Jackson and about how a lot of times jobs were given based on patronage, and that's how it was done. You have the Pendleton Act of 1883, and that's the first big statute in this area under President Chester Arthur, an underappreciated president in some ways, and always listed as one of the least known presidents, but one of the big things that he did was the Pendleton Act and signed that, and he implemented it. And that established the Civil Service Commission. That established the concept that you would, that people would be brought into the federal service because of expertise to some extent and not based on political affiliation. In fact, that part of the civil service has been there since the beginning, that you don't decide based on political affiliation. Now, those original employees were at will, and they were at will for a long time, but they could not be terminated for political reasons and also for religious reasons. You have the Lloyd-LaFollette Act of 1912, and that essentially, it implemented certain executive orders from Presidents McKinley and Roosevelt, which indicated that you can only fire for cause, although without appeal. So it didn't establish a trial or right to an appeal, but it did establish the for cause requirement. You have the Veterans Preference Act of 1944, and that's the first time you begin to see in the federal service the idea of the appeal, and that was for veterans who were selected based on veteran preference. And the idea was, well, you wanted to protect that preference so that veterans weren't just hired and then fired. So that was the reason for the first appeals that existed in this area. You had the President Kennedy and Nixon really sort of build on that idea of appeals. And then you had the big case in this area, Board of Regents v. Roth, Arnett v. Kennedy, the Supreme Court in the 1970s, establishing that there was a constitutional due process right in your job, in some sense that you own your job if you're a federal civil servant, and that's caused some degree of controversy that we'll talk about today. Justice Rehnquist famously said about federal employees that they must take the bitter with the sweet. And although the Supreme Court has sort of walked away from that statement, it really resonates today because we're talking again about, well, there's a lot of sweet or benefits to being a federal employee. Of course, we owe a lot to federal employees too. They do a lot of great things for us. But now we're talking a bit about the bitter too. And to what extent should federal employees be able to be fired at will or close to at will? And then, of course, the biggest act in the area since the Pendleton Act was the Civil Service Reform Act of 1974, establishing the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Senior Executive Service, Chapters 43 and 75, which explain how you can remove a federal civil servant for cause because of poor performance or because of misconduct. And that brings us to, and that was in 1974, that's really the legal framework coming in today. There were a couple other statutes, a couple other cases, of course, but then you had President Trump issue Schedule F, his executive order in his first administration, establishing that among, for policy making, policy advocating, policy developing officials, and there was some debate at how many people are we talking about, 5,000, 80,000? I've heard different estimates of how many people we're talking about, but that those individuals would go back to being at will. They would not be, they could not be hired or fired based on political affiliation. That would still be unlawful. That would be a prohibited personnel action, but they would be at will. And that is a fundamental change to the civil service. There's reasons for and against it. We're going to talk about that today. Both of us, if I may speak for you a little bit, Jonathan, here, had a good experience with the civil service in our jobs. I was OFCCP director. OFCCP was, I like to say, and this is just my opinion, and it's a little biased as having been the director during this time, I felt it was the high water mark for the agency. We were extremely productive during the first Trump administration. So obviously what's happening now is very different with OFCCP. But when I was there, I worked with a tremendous group of dedicated public servants who cared deeply about what they were doing and about civil rights law. Were they more liberal than me politically? Yeah, probably. But we worked along well. We got along well, and we were very productive. And I remember having meetings, and they would all be around me, and we would set the goals for the agency. And I would be the liaison with the Secretary's office and with Jonathan, and I would come back to them with what the policy direction would be, and then I'd have my policy directors develop that. I did a big focus on recognition and awards, and it was a very successful time. But I do remember one conversation I had with a high-level official there who told me once when I found out that he had had 9 grievances brought against him during his time there. And for me, as an employment lawyer, and as someone who, thankfully, as far hasn't had a grievance, I was like mortified by that. And I asked him about that. Like, how do you have 9? You're such a great guy. Like everyone loves you. How do you have 9? And he goes, that's being a manager in the federal government. We get grievances. You get grievances for when you get a rating, like your personnel rating, you can grieve that. You can get grievances sometimes for being moved if it's viewed as a demotion in some way. You can get grievances for a lot of things. And I remember that resonated with me, and then 2 other stats resonated with me, and they're used as justifications for Schedule F, is that they polled a lot of supervisors and managers in the federal government, and only 41% of supervisors said that they felt confident they could remove a subordinate employee for serious misconduct, and only 26% said that for poor performance. So I've talked enough to sort of set the stage. Jonathan, you're at the Cicero Institute. You've done a lot of thinking in this area. How do you reimagine the federal service? I have some thoughts too, but let's let you talk a little bit right now.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I think that there's probably 2 things to point out. And one is that this fight between career staff and political staff is not uniquely partisan. We both have friends who have served in Democrat administrations, and there is a fight between the political staff and the career staff in both Republican and Democrat administrations. I think what is a unique thing and may kind of motivate some of the current thinking is that historically that fight between conservative administrations and the career staff has looked much more like it has traditionally looked for Republicans and Democrats. And I think that we did see in the first Trump administration a concerted effort by segments of, not the vast majority, not most, but by segments of the career staff, many of whom were in policy roles, to internally resist the administration. And I think that that does color a lot of the conversation. And that is what part of the motivation for people saying, hey, we should reimagine this. I will take a step back and I will say, if Schedule F had been kept in place, or if the new executive order, if the new kind of policymaker role is fixed in stone and it remains in place, and the next Democrat administration comes in, I don't think they'll get rid of it. I think that both sides of the aisle would like the ability to say to senior members who work on policy that their job is not to determine what the department ought to be thinking about long term. Their job is to effectuate the administration's agenda. And so I think that that is something that, while there is a partisan fight to this right now, I do think over the long term, the vast majority of people who have been in those offices, if they were being honest. Now, obviously, there's a political valence to this entire conversation, but if those people were being honest, I think that they would be very comfortable with a world where those deputy assistant secretaries who are careers, who are working on policy, those senior policy leaders inside of a building, if those people could be terminated if they told their staff, don't work on that, work on this thing I want you to work on, or if they allowed their staff to change documents without turning on track changes for other things. Like, these things happen. They happen to both sides. I'm not saying that this is uniquely a Republican or Democrat thing, but I do think that there is a lot of consternation by the leadership with some of their non-career or the career leadership. And I do think that that creates some challenges and motivates a lot of these conversations.
Well, so here's one challenge. This is one reason why I sometimes see, and maybe part of this is that sometimes Republican officials have not been in government before, and so they're coming in from the private sector. A lot of times they see, people who are office holders who are enforcing laws. You heard 180 laws, in the Department of Labor, for example, and they come in and say, well, here's the new policy. This is what we're going to do. And of course, you have to, that could be illegal, at least under the current law. You might need a statutory change. You might need a regulatory change. You may need to put out some additional guidance. That could take time. And a lot of times, we were the ones who were going to, some of the senior advisors in the administration saying, well, wait, we need to do a regulatory change. They're making a good point there. That's why we have a federal civil service. Their primary goal ultimately is to the Constitution and the law, and in anything that's discretionary to the president. I mean, that's the idea. So and I think in Republican administrations, maybe there's a view that the discretionary is broader than perhaps Democratic administrations. But the point is, I think you agree there. You do want to have some protections for the federal civil service to say, hey, that violates the statute. You shouldn't do that. In a sense, protecting you.
No, I think that there is a push and pull that ought to happen, right? And that's going on, I guarantee, in the current building. I mean, we both have friends who are inside the U.S. Department of Labor and other parts of the administration. You want that conversation to happen. What you don't want to have happen is when a decision gets made by the secretary or by the president that the department is going to go in a particular direction, people who lost that policy fight to now put up barriers to actually getting down that path. And that's true on both sides. If when President Obama said we are not going to enforce certain immigration laws, people who are career staff at Immigration and Customs Enforcement, if they said, no, we're going to do it anyway, that's a problem. Now, politically, people on our side of the aisle might like that those people resisted. And in the same way, people at the U.S. Department of Labor might like that they said, no, we think OSHA shouldn't do what the secretary wants on an emergency technical standard on vaccines or on masks or things of that nature. Those fights may happen, and there may be political partisans who like the direction career staff have taken, but that doesn't justify what they're doing. And if they're in a senior enough role, I think the argument is that those people have a choice to make in the same way that I had a choice to make when I was in private law practice, or I do in my current job. If I cannot in good conscience work on the thing that I've been directed to do by my superiors, assuming that it is not an illegal order, then I can either resign or look for something new to do. Those become the options instead of saying I'm going to internally resist.
But presumably that would be just at the policymaking level, because most technical jobs, you wouldn't be deciding whether to do that or not. You would have a directive from your SES, from your career leader, your GS-15, telling you what to do, and you would implement it. If you implemented it well, you would advance. If you didn't, you might get disciplined and get put on a performance improvement plan eventually. But it's those, and here's a couple things I think about. When an administration comes in, they got 4 years. That's what they know. And a lot of them, this administration has acted really quickly. Most take some time, in part because there was a prior one, and they had a gap in time to think about what they wanted to do. But most administrations take some time to ramp up too. And so you're left with a limited amount of time. So that responsiveness of career staff is extraordinarily important. I guess the question I would have, Jonathan, though, is if the idea is that you want more at-will employees at the very high levels of the government, is it better to make them Schedule C, political appointees, and to expand the political service, which, again, is only 4,000 compared to 2.2 million? Or is it better to create this group of employees that are now at will, but not political, but also maybe not so willing to stay anymore, knowing that they're gonna, that as administrations change, they may get pushed out?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that that's one that every administration will wrestle with. I think that the value of having folks who are going to be in the building day after day, regardless of whether or not they have been appointed by that administration, is that it does, to your point, take time to get people into the building. If you were to add a significant number, Republican and Democrat administrations would have a harder time filling those ranks. There would be loss of information that is important to the continuity of many of the things that both parties agree with, right? Like, there's not a lot of people who think the Department of Labor shouldn't be dealing with child labor laws, right? Everybody agrees that's a very simple one, right? Like, certain things that exist out there, it's easy for everyone to agree they should do. And so having people in those positions could do it makes a lot of sense. What I think that the real conversation is whether this looks more like all normal jobs outside of government, or whether it needs to look like the government roles. And in normal jobs, if a new CEO shows up at Delta Airlines or a new president comes in at NYU, the faculty may not lose their positions at NYU. The people who work at Delta Airlines may not lose their position, or at Boeing or wherever, but they now have a new direction. And if the people don't like the direction that is going, then traditionally outside of the government, they have had, again, that choice of do we stay or do we go? And in the government, there has been kind of this third option of I'm allowed to disagree vehemently and maybe not do my job well because I have a civil service protection. And if that is true, then I think that creating an opportunity for those senior leaders to be told, hey, you're going to be evaluated whether or not you are able to help us, the political leadership of the building, advance the agenda that we have set out, does provide an opportunity for them to lead because they have built up a career in that building. And so I think that's kind of the conversation that's being had.
Can I ask, is it clear that Schedule F would only apply to 4,000?
No, the 4,000 are political SES, presidential appointees, and Schedule C.
Right, so who would the Schedule F apply to?
Up to 80,000 employees. There's some debate about how broad that would be. It's anyone in a policy-making, policy advocating, or policy developing role. So that depends on how broadly you look at that. And Democratic and Republican administrations may take a different view. They're letting the agencies come up with that list currently, but under the new proposal, it's going to be the president who ultimately makes the decision. So obviously that could change across administrations too. But I'll tell you one thing, I always thought this was very interesting. I think your view on what's happening might depend on your view on this example. I remember one thing in the federal government that I did not see, even in state, in local government or in the private sector, is, so I'm the agency head. We have a big case, we did enforcement actions. We have a big case that I think is appropriate to settle. Or we have a new policy I want to put out as a directive. My senior level people would write me memos explaining why I was wrong. And it wouldn't be like meeting with me and telling me, I think you're wrong, and let's discuss it. And then we come to a approach, and if they disagree, they disagree. No, they would write me a memo explaining why I was wrong. And sometimes, as someone who has been in the government, I was okay with it. I would write a memo back explaining why I was right. And I would always make sure that was in the record. But I have to tell you, a lot of people coming from the private sector, they don't know what to do about that. And they feel like they're being sabotaged. So, and I don't know what I think about it either. I think that there's something to be said for that. But it's certainly not how you would run a private sector organization, generally, unless someone's doing something illegal. But this was not about doing things illegal. This was, I disagree with you. But I'm the one who's supposed to establish what we're trying to do here. And now I have to spend a lot of time, responding to this because I know I'm going to get a FOIA request, and I don't know if the next administration is going to release this or not. And so, that sort of, what do you think about that? Because we did get that a lot. You got that more than anyone, being in the policy shop.
Yeah, and I think that, sometimes the question really comes down to, is the purpose of that memo or of the document that you're being given to try to point out an actual legal or like policy problem, or is it simply a disagreement? And often in the policy office, we had legal memos masquerade, we had policy memos masquerading as legal documents. I'm a lawyer, I understand the law, I understand administrative law. If I have someone tell me that it is illegal to use, and this was pre-Chevron, or during Chevron's existence, it was illegal to have discretion as an agency, I'm like, no, we have it. So the question is, how risk tolerant are we as a department? That's a conversation, but that's not one that I need a memo explaining to me that I'm not legally allowed to tell the secretary he can or can't do something. And so I think that sometimes the challenge is, what's the purpose of that memo? Is the purpose of the memo so that they can then tell a friend, hey, you should FOIA request this thing, or you should call a congressional investigation for something? And if it's that becomes problematic. If on the flip side, it is in good faith an attempt to help move us toward the direction that we're all trying to go, of having good policies that protect the workers, protect the American people, whatever your department's ambit is, then I don't think people have an issue. But I do think that on both sides of the aisle, in those leadership positions, you have a ton on your plate. And so getting things that are not actually reasonable, but are just the person disagrees with you, and instead of just having the fight in the meetings that you're supposed to have those fights, they then turn to their office and are not spending their time doing the work that they've been directed to do, but are spending the time putting a memo together. That's where you have political problems that I think come up.
So it sounds to me like it's a difference between disagreements versus resistance. Right?
Well, and I don't know if they would necessarily say it was resistance. A lot of these individuals, I assume most of them are acting in good faith. They feel that that's their job. And, that's sort of what we have to think about as a country. What's in the long-term best interest of the United States? Obviously, an administration is going to want to do what the president wants. And, usually that's going to prevail unless the courts say otherwise. But in the long term, there probably is, in my opinion, having been a federal agency head, having everyone own their job and have substantial due process rights probably does make it harder for the federal civil service to be responsive. I get a lot more responsiveness at my law firm, for example, because, they know that, put it this way, they don't write me memos objecting to the legal position we're taking usually. So, so that's true. On the other hand, I want to get the best and brightest into the federal government. I think everybody does. And, that's the sweet part of being in the civil service. And part of that is getting a pension of some sort, although even that's been diminished, but getting a pension of some sort and getting job security of some sort. That's why people give up the money they can make in the private sector. So if you give them at will, we're going to lose a lot of people, and we have. We've lost a lot of people. The 59,000 people have been removed according to the federal government, but according to the statistics, it could be several 100,000 who have left or lost their jobs. So, and look, they're going to hire as well, and people will be more accepting of that at-will relationship. But do you think it's going to affect the quality of the people that we have in the federal government if they don't have something beyond at-will?
So I think that there's probably a question, and in a room full of lawyers, we've all got good friends who are really smart, who are in the federal government, and are really good folks. But we also all know people who were not as smart, who are in the federal government or doing roles in the federal government. And so the question is, are those 100,000 or plus or minus people, the ones leaving, are those the people who we all were like, wow, that person was really, that was the smart person in my law school class who's at DOJ? Or was that the person who everyone was like, I know why they took the government job? I mean, we all know that, right? I mean, this is the open secret of there are people who have jobs in the government, jobs in nonprofit sectors who are really, really great. And then there's other people who aren't. It's really hard to stay at K&L Gates and make partner if you're really, really bad. It is not really, really hard to do that in the government. We all know that's true. That's not to say that the vast majority of the people in the federal government who advance and spend their careers are bad. So the real question is, for those people who have used civil service protection as a shield over their bad work or over their inability or unwillingness to work, does that civil service protection make sense? Because I think the reality is, once we kind of toggle through whatever Schedule F looks like if we could fast forward the tape 20 years from now, and suddenly all the people in policymaking roles were at-will employees, I'm not sure that it's actually that scary to work in the federal government, because you know that those roles, your job is to advance the agenda of the president. The question then becomes, do they suddenly have the ability to say, hey, this person's really not good at their job, and we're going to remove them? Because if you talk to people who are career staff, managers in the government, and they will tell you all the time, it is nearly impossible to remove the bad people who they work with. Part of the problem with Department of Homeland Security when they created it was it became the escape valve for every department in the federal government to send the workers who they wanted to get rid of, and they moved them into Homeland Security. And if you talk to people who were at Homeland Security in its early instances, they would say we could get very little work done in those buildings because they had the people that DOJ got rid of, that Commerce got rid of. There were a lot of folks that wound up happening. And so I think that we all know that exists. And so then the question is, who are the people who are most likely to create problems, and who are the ones who are going to be kind of targeted by these sorts of things?
So, the last thing I would say, and get your last thoughts too before we open it up. We have about 7 minutes left. We have to act with care here. Obviously, this, if I may say, and this is my opinion, and it's patriotic. This has been in my opinion, the most successful country in the world. We have had the most successful government in the world, and we are certainly the preeminent government in the world. And a lot of this has been since World War II, which is when the federal service became very large. How do we do that? We need to be very careful here. I wonder how careful we are being. I do think a country should always reimagine itself and go through a period of renewal. And I think a lot of what's happening is popular with the public, at least in terms of fraud, waste, and abuse. But we want to retain our lead in the world, and our lead in the world is large. In part, a lot of it's the business of America and the growth of America, but part of it is the government of America. We do have the best government in the world, in my opinion, and the best military in the world, in my opinion. So how do we not mess with that?
Yeah, and I think that this tells us that part of what we need is a conversation, and Congress needs to decide. Now, that's its own ball of wax, right? That's a challenge. But the reality is, the best way to address civil service challenges would be for us to have a national conversation that results in real legislation, because there are people who we know ought to get fired, right? There's the EPA employee who spent copious numbers of hours every week sitting at their desk watching inappropriate content. We all know that story, right? That is a person who couldn't be terminated. New York has the rubber rooms for teachers, right? We know these things exist, and nobody supports that. But in order to protect other things, we've kept those laws on the books. And so if what we need to do is say, hey, policymaking roles need to do it, or if what we need to say is, hey, legal roles need to not have civil service protection because your job is to be the lawyer to your client, the federal agency, and if you don't like what your client wants to do in private practice, you say, I can't represent you anymore. And that's the conversation. So those are the sorts of nuances that we probably need to take. There's probably jobs in the federal government that we need to pay people 10 times as much for, and some that we need to pay people 10 times less. And those sorts of conversations are much better had rather than administration by administration, but via Congress.
I do think in the end you will see, as this all sort of shakes out, that you will see probably even bigger back and forth between administrations, because the federal civil service will probably become more responsive. But there's a good to that, and there's also the concern that it decreases stability over time. So we have to think about this as a country, what really is in the best interest, while always affirming our gratitude to the federal civil service. It's a tough time for federal servants right now, but it hopefully will become a good time, so eventually. And that's why we're talking about reimagining the long term. And I know that many federal civil servants are here today, and I've talked to a couple who've come up to me. So anyhow, do you have any final words, Jonathan, before we open up to questions?
Thanks
All
so much
right.
for having me.
So why don't we open it up to questions? Are there any questions? I think over there. And let me just say, best government in the world, best defense in the world, and thanks to Professor Estreicher, this is the best conference in the world.
Here, here. Hi,
And that's not hyperbole.
my
It's
name
not.
is Karen Ortiz. I'm an EEOC administrative judge. I would love if the panel would address Schedule F as they're intending to implicate it, which would include GS-14s and below, like myself. And in the context of the administration we're dealing with, which is a lawless administration, I was actually named by President Trump in one of his fact sheets in support of Schedule F. And Andrea Lucas, who was supposed to speak today, is trying to currently fire me. So I'm not surprised she didn't show up. She probably
Do you
knew
have a
I was here.
question?
I did ask my question. If you could
So whether it
address
should go to-
the
so-
expansion of Schedule F to GS-14s and below.
So I'm not going to address part of that. The part I'll address is how far down in the civil service should, the schedule policy career, which used to be called Schedule F, how far should that go? Schedule F originally was not going to go that far down. It was going to stay at the top, the veneer. It was going to be like at OFCCP, it would have been SES and GS-15s. So now you're talking about potentially going farther down. I don't know. I mean, in the long run, I think that, and we'll see how the regulation ends up going. I think there's a good argument you want to stick at 15 in SES and those 14 who are in truly policy-making roles. But the issue is, the reason why I sort of am more into keeping it at the top is because I also think it's practically going to be very difficult. Like, right now, there's a system in place for a couple million people. And you certainly don't want a president coming in and replacing millions of people, or even tens of thousands. And I think it's important to remember that the idea behind this schedule is that they wouldn't be replaced. They wouldn't be replaced, that they would be, not be able to be politically removed. So there's a bit of nuance here. How far down did you go? How far would you go?
I mean, I think it really depends on the role that the person has. If you've got a GS-11 who is doing an actual policy-making role where we had junior staffers in our offices who were, political appointees who were definitely doing policy-making roles. If you have someone who is a GS-11 who is doing that, that could be an interesting conversation. I think you want to start at the top because ultimately most of these decisions, there's the rare GS-11 who's making a policy decision by her or himself. And so that's harder. Whereas in SES, that makes a ton of sense where they have significant authority in a lot of cases, like in Department of Labor and a lot of other agencies, you have the head of a field office who is an SES, and that person, in a lot of ways, has significant authority, right? Like, they may call Jonathan and say, hey, here's what we're doing from the solicitor's office, but if they decided to file a motion and not tell the national office, it could be months or even years before the national office knew about those things, right? Like, that is the way it goes. So for those people, it might make sense at a lower number, whereas maybe in DC, it should be a higher number.
I think the interesting point, though, for me, is that often when I wanted to do new policy, the DepSec, they would want me to get the approval of my career deputy or the career solicitor. That's what they would want. And I was willing to overrule them, but a lot of political appointees are not. And they want the career person to change their opinion to support what they want to do. I have mixed feelings about that. I do think, at the one hand, you do want your career person to be supporting you and helping you to achieve these goals, but they should be able to remain true to their professional opinion. So that's going to be a tough nut to crack. That's the nuance. Yes.
Question over here?
As you said.
Please identify yourself.
Sure. As you said.
Please identify yourself.
Oh, identify.
yourself.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry. Suzanne Campbell, U.S. Department of Labor. My opinions are my own. As you said, and I agree, we have the best government in the world, but having a civil service is pretty much universal. Every government in the world
That's
has
true.
one, even monarchies. And I'm sure that the problems you've identified exist worldwide. Is anyone in this reform movement looking at solutions that other countries have tried, making people more at will or less at will or whatever, and are we modeling this after anything?
Yeah, so in some ways, I think part of the model that a lot of people are looking at is actually the U.S. civil service back when we still had a civil service exam. And I think, there was a different kind of process of becoming a federal employee, right? World War II, that era where the federal government grew a lot, the number of kids who are graduating from Princeton who are being recruited straight into the federal government today is significantly lower than it used to be, right? And I think that that's the number of kids who are graduating from this law school who are going straight into the federal government is significantly less than it used to be, right? And I think that that's an interesting conversation about what did the past look like. I think that there are a lot of countries around the world that civil service is seen as a prestigious thing, but it is really hard to get into. Whereas in the United States, frankly, it's not anywhere near as hard to get into the federal service. It is harder to get into other sorts of things, right? If you want to become a doctor in the federal government, it's easier than if you want to become a doctor at NYU Hospital, right? Like we know that that is true. So I think that those are the sorts of models that people are looking at of can we create higher barriers to get in for the people who are going to have these more prestigious roles? And if you do that, then maybe their desire to keep those positions will be a part of the conversation.
All right, we have one final question over here.
Identify yourself, Vicki.
Okay. I'm Vicki Lipnick. I'm a partner at Resolution Economics, and also, like Craig, a lot of experience running a number of federal agencies, including the EEOC, and also I served as an Assistant Secretary of Labor. My question is not on the civil service protections aspect, but it's on something else that's getting a lot of attention, both through President Trump's executive orders and has bipartisan support, which is this Chance to Compete Act, and it's the upfront hiring of people based on skills in the federal service, not based on degree requirements. And I really hate to say that, speaking at a university, but there's a lot of emphasis on, look, that's how we need to have more assessments for skills. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about both that Chance to Compete Act, and also there's a pretty significant memo from the Office of Personnel Management just in the last couple of weeks about all of the actions that the administration is taking to try to implement that, to really get rid of any kind of race, gender assessments whatsoever. So overall, I'm just curious what you think of that front end of trying to hiring people.
Well, let me say a few words, and then I'll turn it over to you to finish. So, it's very interesting. I'm supportive of the idea that we have too many college degrees. I mean, anyone who's in the area of adverse impact, from guidelines, there's always that concern that wouldn't it be great to have someone with a PhD or a master's, and then you greatly reduce the applicant pool. And also sometimes you miss people who have more practical experience, who go through apprenticeships, things like that. And I think that's something that both Democratic and Republican administrations have been in favor of. So yes, I think that that's definitely something that should be looked at. I would note that this administration has been very focused on that, even in the disparate impact executive order, where they said they're going to de-emphasize disparate impact. They indicated that they're still going to be looking at colleges, and they're going to, degree requirements, and they're going to be publishing on that. And they want to de-emphasize the idea of degree requirements too, which of course is a classic disparate impact issue. But, they're having their cake and eating it too a little bit in that executive order. But the point is, it is important to them. And so I think you're going to see that continue and be something that, in my view, is very positive coming out of what's happening.
Yeah, and I'll just say, we do a lot of work at Cicero in states, and when I was at Labor Department, was part of the team that wrote President Trump's executive order in the first admin on college degree requirements. It's one of a very small handful of executive orders that was not repealed when President Biden walked in. Office of Personnel Management continued to implement it. Then governors across the country, starting with a Republican in Maryland, although nobody likes to talk about it, they like to pretend like the governor of Pennsylvania was the first one to sign an executive order on it. Sorry, if Shapiro fans, he was like the eighth, but that's okay. There's a ton of Republican and Democrat governors across the country who have signed executive orders on eliminating college degree requirements because they're realizing things like Governor Hogan's team did in Maryland, that there were people applying for IT security jobs at the Department of Transportation in Maryland being turned down because they didn't have an IT security degree and they'd spent the last 6 years at the NSA. And they said, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think that, it is hard in an academic environment. Most of us have degrees from places that we like to tell everybody about because it's good at cocktail parties to tell people where we went and why we did it. But we also recognize that there's a lot of people who go to places that aren't really getting the value of that education to what they're going to do long term is not really there. And so for us to say, hey, in order to do this job in the government, you have to have a college degree, doesn't make a lot of sense if that degree doesn't actually relate to the work they're doing. And so that's why we're seeing the federal government, the state governments doing it. I think that we're going to see a lot more of it. The private sector has been doing it for a while, but I think the private sector is going to redouble their efforts on that area as well.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.